Brilliance Audio presents Spring House by Mary Ellen Taylor, performed by Shannon Mcmanus. All houses are haunted. All persons are haunted. Throngs of spirits follow us everywhere. We are never alone. Barney Serecki. Prologue. Adele. Tuesday, September 19th, 2017. Cape Hudson, Virginia, in the Chesapeake Bay. 11 o'clock a.m. In Adele Jessup's almost 100 years of living, she had learned that blessings and curses came hand in hand. Love and birth were always counterbalanced by pain and death. She sat in her wheelchair, watching the dozens of mourners gathered around the casket draped with an American flag. The overcast sky hovered above, as strong winds, thick with a promise of rain, swirled and teased the edges of her black skirt. She shifted her attention away from the scene before her to the headstones that surrounded the freshly dug hole. These graves belonged to her husband and his brothers. The Jessup boys had all been born and raised on Virginia's eastern shore. Good, proud men, they had remained loyal to each other all their lives. Sitting beside her now was Samuel Jessup, her brother-in-law, the last of the Jessup siblings. He had shaved and had his hair cut. His black merchant marine captain's uniform was freshly cleaned, its brass buttons polished. However, he wore none of the medals he had earned in more than 5 decades of service. His tall, lean frame had grown frail, and his right hand trembled constantly. But he had refused his wheelchair, always too proud and stubborn for his own good. How many times had the two of them sat here over the years, mourning the loss of one of their own? Like her, Samuel surely must feel closer to the dead now than to the living. Today, they had gathered to honor the life of her great-grandson, Scott Jessup, a Marine who had died 5 days earlier when his helicopter crashed in the Atlantic Ocean during a storm. He had been on a rescue mission, searching for lost seamen whose ship had been taking on water. He had saved one, deposited him safely on a naval vessel, and then returned to search for more. Scott, like all the Jessup men, had been drawn to the water. He had grown up hearing the talks of the brave seafaring men in his family, and he fully understood that the weather and ocean gave as easily as they took. Scott had been good, brave, and sometimes too self-indulgent, but then he had been only 27 when he died. A flicker of movement beyond the mourners caught her gaze, and she looked toward the wrought iron fence that surrounded the small family cemetery on the eastern shore. A young man stood there alone. Her failing eyes could not make out his face. She assumed he was another mourner, until he began to move forward. But then she realized it was Scott. Adele was not surprised to see him. The veil separating her from death was so painfully thin now that spirits were just as easy to see as the living. Scott walked up to his mother, Helen Jessup, seated in front of her son's casket. She clutched a worn Bible and openly wept. Helen had adored her only child, and his death had sliced her heart so completely that no words or deeds would mend it. Scott laid his hand on his mother's shoulder, but she did not seem to notice. But Samuel saw him, and when the two locked gazes, a faint smile tweaked the edge of Scott's lips. Samuel placed his hand softly over Adele's and gently squeezed. Next to Helen sat a grim-faced man dressed in a U.S. Marine's uniform. Rick Markham had not only served with Scott and all the pallbearers, but they had also been good friends. His dark hair was closely cropped and accentuated stern features. Though he could not have been much older than Scott, he seemed to carry the burden of Atlas on his shoulders. Scott offered Rick a reassuring smile, but that, too, went unseen. Adele took a...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?